They throw all these like single one-line arguments and then call it like a total like 5-point extension. You know, argue sufficiently any of the points that Lucas made. I want to say that they were bad points per se, but I thought they were totally hung on contingent on the idea of prosperity. Like if we are prosperous, then we will have these benefits like investment, like people coming in, like seriously guys, like that's not how you debate, okay? So like, alright, let's go to a couple of things first. Let's attack first the idea of democracy. Their entire case, right, if you really listen to it closely, it's why democracy is good, why we have a separation of powers, why we have a process on which we are able to seek recourse. That's not happening in our context. Like, honestly guys, the motion presupposes that we have a context of dictatorship. We have a context where the system has failed, where social injustice are being perpetrated by either an acquiescent or silent and ignorant majority who would continuously pass policies that repress and suppress the rights of people. That's what our motion is about. But then moreover, they also like go on and condemn like people like FARC and the Taliban. This is very funny because what we're going to say here, very clearly is this. That these guys are criminal. These guys are engaging in criminal ideals that can never be sought and attained, right? Things are irrational, for instance, right? Like religion, like you want to kill all the Jews. That's irrational, you can't get that outcome. But when you look at social injustices, the outcomes are fairly quantifiable, right? To live properly, or like really, like we have particular agendas, things that can be fulfilled. There's something you need to remember. Social injustices are not your irrational religious no thank you, irrational kind of parties. So at the end of the day, what we really need to evaluate is whether violence is the legitimate form, is a form in itself that can be legitimately exercised. And we'll tell you how it can and why it should be in certain instances. So thank you. They made a few like interesting points in their speech, right? And mostly in Ashich's speech. They said firstly that there are other alternatives to doing this. There is a moral mandate for like democracies who have like majorities who want to repress minorities to continue to repress minorities. We think that's absolutely flawed for the reason that their continuous repression clearly shows that there's a system that's broken. There's a system that continuously seeks to eradicate or at least like deprive a significant and substantial portion of people their rights. Moreover, we realize that in those places the courts don't work any longer very well. They're probably corrupted. In those systems, the process don't work itself. You can't really get yourself into political office because in some cases you can't run for political office. You can't get the votes. You can't get yourself in office. And when people are pushed into the corner, we think that violence is a legitimate means for them to act in self-defense, which will be one of our extensions later. But secondly, they told you that you hurt innocence. This is a very funny point, right? Because we want to say a couple of things. We say firstly, innocence is not something that's absolute. Those people who live in those areas, although there's a certain degree, we argue that there's some extent of culpability. Like they are partially responsible for the system of repression that has been perpetrated for their own self-interest. I.e., they have voted in governments that are irresponsible in the way in which they craft policies that harm and rob humans within those places and minorities of their dignity. We argue on this level that when you have violence that occurs, right, or some kind of escalation with an agenda, with a social agenda, we argue that we think that many moderates will actually listen and come to the table. In some instances, they might even pressure their governments to change, pressure their governments to try to restore rights back to those people who those rights have been robbed from. Then they told us about this idea about undermining your own cause, right? They told us that, end of the day, these people are going to undermine their own cause, you lose support, so on and so forth. We think that in the case of social injustices, we think they are usually fueled by a rational calculus, by a rational idea to seek some kind of recourse that's fair, right? To that extent, we think that they won't go and engage in the kind of harmful behavior that FARC and the Taliban have engaged in. No, thank you. We moreover tell you that this can be corrected to the state at a measurable cost. It's not as though the cost is overly onerous for the state to grant. So this you're not looking at like a really bad thing, like for instance they want to secede or something like that. It's basically granting fundamental rights, the right to vote, the right to do something. But I'll give opening a chance.
So, under your comments, the many reasons why violence justifies further state oppression, produces international buying, and makes the lives of these people worse off. So why exactly are we talking only about democracy?
But that can equally work the other way, right? Violence can essentially prompt people to discuss the issue, to be able to recognize the injustices that have been done, and to try to find ways in which you can correct it and negotiate agreements. We've seen in places like Ireland, as we've seen in the cases of Sri Lanka. Right? Then we look at the extension that we want to give to you. Two things. First of all, we tell you that violence in particular, on its own as a virtue, is not something that's inherently bad, right? We argue and we tell you this, that in certain situations, violence is necessary in order to invoke a certain sense of quick response or a certain kind of escalated and fast response to a problem that's pressing. That's why we allow ourselves in certain instances for states to legitimately wage war to obtain certain concessions. When you wage war, you're not looking to like completely eradicate a particular thing. You're looking to extract concessions. The measures in which normal citizens like you and I, right, are able to access concessions are places such as blackmailing the state through like lobby groups, through like pushing through the courts in certain places like India. What we argue then, therefore, is that it's a legitimate way when those avenues are no longer available to you. And this is a last resort. This is something that you must engage upon. Because why, if you don't engage in that in the early stages of social injustices, no thank you, what we argue to you is this. We say that the act of first belligerence in most instances of dictatorship and repressive regimes is the act of social injustice. It's the act that we can dehumanize people. It's the act that we can label the Karens as people who are less than us. That's where we can grant them less rights when it comes to access of anything. To that extent, if they don't respond in kind, it's this way in some instances. The machinery that represses them grows too large. And if you don't delay that, if you delay that response, that large machinery will continue to overwhelm them to a point where there's a power asymmetry that will exist between woke actors that it will be impossible through the means of violence or through any means whatsoever, except for a full-on war, to be able to kind of restore the leverage through a third party, right? So, I mean, you need to get a third party to come in to truly like get the power balances corrected, such in the case of Libya. What we argue there, here, ladies and gentlemen, is that we all supplement what we on the second level to what was said earlier. We say there's a doctrine of self-defense that we must think about. We say that when grave harm has been inflicted on your rights and your ability to actualize your person and your dignity, we think it's fair that people have the right to exercise the action to abruptly end the injustice, or rather invoke an end to the injustice. So like the point of information that Valerie raised, like if you're being raped in the middle, there are many options that could be available to you like halfway, after the fact, right? But doesn't negate the legitimacy of your actions to hit back and to kill your oppressor, to kill your rapist. We argue that many of these people are put in extremely vulnerable situations. Therefore, we think violence can be legitimized in some instances, especially when it comes to social injustice. Because if not, you're sustaining that violence, you're sustaining the repression, you're sustaining and allowing for that to continue, and that's more harmful to you in the long run. So because we believe in violence being a legitimate tool as a principle, we also told you the doctrine of self-defense we continue to propose.